Part 44. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 431. Jeongna has a great figure. In this holy realm, the only one who can compare with Jenna in stature is probably Dimansa. But unlike Dimansha, Jenna's temperament is that of a cold beauty. Just like an iceberg. But this kind of Jenna makes people want to melt her away even more. Now Jenna's clothes were torn because of what happened just now. Jenna looks so beautiful at this moment. Although the iceberg's temperament seems to repel people thousands of miles away, the hot and proud figure makes people's hearts beat faster. Chen Tao approached Jenna. Jenna was slightly startled, seeing Chen Tao's face getting closer and closer. She subconsciously leaned back and lay on the bed. But Chen Tao still got closer, his face very close to Jenna. Under Jenna's eyelashes, her big eyes were filled with confusion. She said, Lei Ji died, but it was your turn. Hearing this, Chen Tao smiled, raised his big hand, touched Jenna's cheek, and said with a smile, I am different from him. What's the difference? Jenna said, you want to do that kind of thing to me, just like he does to me. Look at Jenna's big moving eyes. Chen Tao smiled and said, of course it is different. He is just an ordinary man, but I am a real man. Chen Tao leaned close to Jenna's ear. Compared to him, I can do more things. Jenna's eyes were filled with confusion and she closed her eyes. I don't know the difference between an ordinary man and a real man, Jenna said softly. Chen Tao smiled, as long as you know that I am a real man, other men are not good. I don't want you to know the difference between us. Jenna's face turned red and she closed her eyes. It's up to you, I'm like this anyway. So good. The night passed quickly. Early the next morning, Jenna seemed to wake up from a long dream, and she slowly opened her eyes. She looked at the man lying next to her, her eyes glowing. Is he a real man? Jenna murmured to herself. Jenna doesn't quite understand, but Jenna knows that she must have this man. Jenna looked at Chen Tao. Although she wanted to lie in his arms for more time, she thought of today's work. Jenna could only give up the idea and then moved her body. Jenna suddenly felt a sense of soreness in the muscles all over her body. It felt like muscle fatigue the day after excessive training. Jenna frowned. The work needs to be finished today. Jenna dragged her tired body to get up. She picked up a nightgown from the side, draped it behind her, put her feet down, and got out of bed. As soon as he got out of bed, his legs went weak, he was unsteady and his body fell forward. Suddenly, Jenna felt her waist tighten and a soft force pull her. Jenna fell into a warm embrace. Chen Tao put his hands around Jenna's slender waist and supported her. Jenna was slightly startled and looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao smiled and said, what's wrong? Zhen Na gave Chen Tao a roll of her eyes and said, it's not because of you. Upon hearing this, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, he smiled, raised his hand, scratched the bridge of her nose, and said with a smile, you know how powerful a real man is, right? Jenna looked at Chen Tao, a real man, awesome, I don't understand. However, I want to go to the bathroom and take a shower, I still have to work. Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. He looked at Jenna, smiled and said, it's better not to go today. He gently touched her cheek. Stay with me for a day. Jenna said, now that the laws of the sanctuary have just been changed, the sanctuary is unstable and a bit chaotic. I am the head of the law enforcement group, and I have to stabilize the situation. Jenna looked at Chen Tao, I have to go. Chen Tao blinked and said with a smile, okay, then I'll take you to the bathroom. As he spoke, he raised his hand and hugged Jenna into his arms. Feeling Chen Tao's movements, Jenna looked at Chen Tao with her big eyes, a hint of luster in her eyes. Chen Tao carried her into the bathroom together. It doesn't take long to take a shower, but it still took Chen Tao and Zhen Na 2 hours to finish washing up. After getting out of the bathroom, Change into clothes. Chen Tao looked at Jenna beside him. Jenna was wearing a white leather tights that fit her proud and tall figure. Her long golden hair was tied into a single ponytail, revealing her slender and white neck. She wore a pair of white high heels, which made her proud figure even taller. Chen Tao hugged Jenna from behind, who had just put on her clothes. Chen Tao pulled her into his arms, buried his hair in her hair, and smelled the fragrance of her hair. Jenna's face turned slightly red. She turned her face slightly and looked at Chen Tao. Eyes facing each other. Chen Tao came close to her face and kissed her. Parted lips. Jenna's eyes glowed with a hint of luster. Chen Tao said with a smile, "Are you in such a hurry to go to work?" Jenna said, "Well, do you want to stay?" Chen Tao looked into Jenna's eyes, "You go to work, and I stay and wait. Isn't it too boring? Why don't you stay with me for a day?" Jenna looked at Chen Tao. She thought for a moment, then slowly turned around and came face to face with Chen Tao. She said, "Well." Chen Tao smiled and picked up Jenna. Jenna blushed even more, "I just got dressed." Chen Tao smiled, "It's okay, just wear it again later." Jenna closed her eyes and simply emptied her mind, not thinking about it anymore. At the same time, on the other side, in Chen Tao's bedroom, feeling the light, Betty slowly opened her eyes. As soon as she opened them, Betty did not see Chen Tao. Betty frowned her slender willow leaf eyebrows, raised her small hand, and stroked the place where Chen Tao had been lying before. It was already cold there. In other words, Chen Tao had been gone for quite some time. Betty puffed her cheeks and said, "Big bad guy, you made me like that, but you didn't accompany me. It looks like you're going to find another woman again, big bad guy." Betty sat up, picked up a white shirt next to her, and put the shirt on her body. Betty walked to the bathroom barefoot. Although she blamed Chen Tao a little, Betty was used to it. "That big bad guy, he does this every day." Betty took a bath, put on her clothes, and came out of the bathroom. As soon as she came out, Betty was stunned. She saw a person sitting on the bed, and it was Chen Tao. Chen Tao, wearing a bathrobe, sat on the bed and looked at Betty. Their eyes met. Chen Tao smiled and said, "Are you done washing?" Betty rolled her eyes at Chen Tao and said, "You big bad guy, you went out to have fun and are you back?" Chen Tao smiled, walked to Betty and picked up the petite Betty. He sat at the head of the bed, put her in his arms, stroked Betty's hair, smiled gently and said, "If you don't come back from having fun, I'm afraid I'll hurt you." Upon hearing this, Betty's cheeks flushed slightly, and her little hand pounded Chen Tao's chest. Bad. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 432. Chen Tao coaxed Betty in the bedroom. In this way, Chen Tao comfortably enjoyed himself among the beauties. Time passed little by little, and 10 days later. This day, Betty sat on the sofa board, watching the TV screen. "Betty, how come you have time to watch TV in the living room today?" a voice sounded. Hearing this voice, Betty looked back and found that He Yuxuan was looking at Betty with a smile. Betty's eyebrows stretched slightly, she retracted her sight, looked at the TV screen in front of her, and said, "The bad guy is over at Vera's place, I just watch TV when I have nothing to do." He Yuxuan's eyebrows stretched slightly, she sat on the sofa, her arms around her chest, watching the TV screen. The two did not speak. Betty is not a person who likes to talk, of course she will not take the initiative to talk to He Yuxuan. He Yuxuan looked at Betty, she smiled and said, "I heard that there is a civilization with blue tails and ears and blue skin. Are there such people?" Betty said, "Of course there are. There are hundreds of millions of highly intelligent civilizations in the universe, and many different species are bred in highly intelligent civilizations. Among them, there are such people. She talked while watching TV, and her sweet lowly voice was particularly nice. He Yuxuan said, I also heard that my husband went to that civilization before. Betty blinked her eyes, she thought about it, and she remembered. Chen Tao had indeed been to such a civilization before, and had some close relationships with the two girls. But, Betty turned her head to look at He Yuxuan, how did you know? He Yuxuan smiled, Rose told me. Rose, that voyeur. Betty puffed up her little face and said, no wonder. Rose stared at Chen Tao every moment, observing Chen Tao's every move. It's not surprising that He Yuxuan knew about this through Rose. Betty retracted her gaze and looked at the TV screen. He Yuxuan looked at Betty and smiled and said, I know about this, but I don't know the location of that civilization. Can you help me locate it? Betty said, well, I'll send you the coordinates. A lowly voice sounded. He Yuxuan received the coordinates from Betty and opened a screen. A blue screen appeared in front of He Yuxuan. Through this screen, He Yuxuan could see the situation of the civilization where Yanni and Nia were. Looking at the people with tails, ears, and blue skin inside. He Yuxuan's eyes lit up slightly, there really are such people. I just heard Rose say it before, but I didn't expect it to be true. Betty subconsciously turned her head to look at He Yuxuan. He Yuxuan likes to watch highly intelligent creatures in the outer universe. Betty had heard about this before, and now she looked at He Yuxuan with curiosity. Betty thought to herself, it's true. She retracted her gaze and didn't think much about it. Well, the place where they live seems to be a cave. Why is that building the same style as the villas here? He Yuxuan suddenly discovered something, and her eyes were fixed on a building in the picture. It was a villa. In the civilization of those blue-skinned and blue-tailed people, their residences were directly dug into the mountains and used as houses. But now He Yuxuan saw that there was a villa in the civilized world full of forests, and the style of this villa was exactly the same as that of Earth. He Yuxuan felt very novel. That was the residence left by the bad guy for the two women when he went to that civilization to pick up girls, Betty said in a unique lowly voice. He Yuxuan was startled. She said, so that's how it is. I thought they built it. It was still a novelty. It turned out that my husband built it. Betty said, that civilization is still in the Stone Age. The weapons they use are all made of stone and bone. They haven't even seen a villa like that. He Yuxuan hummed, and she said, well, there are two girls caught in that villa, huh? What's the matter with that girl? Why is she white-skinned, and has a white tail and white ears, and looks so beautiful? Betty didn't even look at it, and said, that's Yanni. Those people are all blue-skinned and blue-eared. People like Yanni are rare. It's probably caused by genetic defects. Before, Betty watched Chen Tao's every move through the screen, so she naturally knew Yanni and Nia. Betty continued, the bad guy talked to Yanni because Yanni looked special, but ended up provoking Yanni and Nia and became his woman. A playboy. She puffed her little face. He Yuxuan looked at Betty and smiled. He Yuxuan didn't care how many girls were around Chen Tao, she only cared whether Chen Tao had her in his heart. And Chen Tao's company during this time told He Yuxuan that she didn't have to worry at all. Of course, He Yuxuan didn't plan to persuade Betty. After all, Betty was right. She didn't like Chen Tao's fickleness, and that was right. He Yuxuan looked through the screen and saw the situation inside. Suddenly, He Yuxuan's eyes slightly relaxed. It seems that Yanni and Nia are in trouble. Trouble? Betty subconsciously looked at the screen. Through the screen, you can see the scenery inside. Yanni and Nia are standing in the yard. And in front of Yanni and Nia, there is a group of people standing. One of them was a man with blue skin and blue ears. He stood in front and looked at Nia and said, Nia, the tree in your house will grow again as long as you pick the fruits. If you give this tree to our tribe, the people in our tribe don't have to risk their lives to collect fruits. The man looked at Nia and said, Nia, Yanni, you two are members of the tribe. For the lives of the people in the tribe, can't you give up this tree to us? Nia frowned cutely, looked at the man, and said, Sensuo, this is not possible. My husband said that this tree cannot be used by our tribe. Sensuo frowned and said, what about your man? Nia said, he went back to his hometown, saying that he had something important to do. Sensuo's eyebrows stretched and said, back to hometown? I think he doesn't want you two anymore. You two are just women abandoned by the warriors. Abandoned women should not be respected by the people of the tribe. Sensuo stared at the two women and said, if you still want to stay in our tribe, you must give this tree to the tribe. This tree can save many people in our tribe. If you don't want to save people in our tribe, then you are not my tribe. Yanni was stunned, she frowned her slender eyebrows, but didn't know what to do. Nonsense, Nia was a little angry, she said, Sensuo, don't bully me while our man is away. This tree was originally left by our man to me and Yanni, you want to rob it? Sensuo snorted, we are robbing? What's wrong? You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 433. Nia was startled. She never expected that Sensuo would so blatantly try to snatch the treasure that Chen Tao left for her and Yanni. Nia frowned angrily and said, you can't do this. Nia looked at the group of tribal people behind Sensuo and said, brothers and sisters of the tribe, is it really okay for us to rob our own people? Sensuo said, there is nothing we can't do. This is for the tribe, we must do it. He stared at Nia and said, Nia, you are so selfish. You have such a thing that could save the lives of people in our tribe, but you are unwilling to let us use it. Now you still think of us as your brothers and sisters, do you think it's suitable? Nia frowned and said, he gave this to us, and he told us not to use it for the tribe. This is his thing. He can give it to us if he wants to. You want to rob it? This is obvious it's your fault. It's too shameless of you to make it sound like it's my Yanni's fault. Haha. Sensuo curled his lips and said, you are selfish, and you dare to call us shameless. Brothers, drive her and Yanni out. From today on, this residence belongs to the tribe. Morito crossed his arms over his chest. Two men next to them came out and walked to either side of Nia and Yanni, holding bone blades. Nia and Yanni looked at the driver, their faces a little ugly. Nia, let's go, Yanni said loudly. Nia frowned, pursed her thin lips, and said, yeah. There was no other way, so Nia left with Yanni. The two went out. Left the villa. Nia and Yanni looked back at the villa behind them. Nia puffed up her face and said, Sensuo and the others are simply robbers. Yanni looked at the angry Nia and then at the villa. Her eyes were filled with luster and she said softly, it would be great if he was here. Nia's bulging face slowly disappeared, and her eyes glowed with luster as she said, if he was here, they would definitely not dare to do this. Really, we don't know where we will go if we are left behind. It caused us to be bullied. Nia kicked away a stone. Yanni said, he may be really in a hurry over there, and we can't say that to him. Well. Nia said, I know, I'm just complaining. He gave us such a good place to live, and gave us endless eternal trees to eat. He was also pretty good to us. It's just, I just want him to be with us, even if he takes us away. But, he is not willing to let us go. Nia puffed her face. Yanni looked at Nia, and then at the villa, what should we do next? Nia said, tribe, we can't go back. Both of us have become other people's women now, and we can't go back to our parents. In the tribe, After a woman gets married, it means she has nothing to do with her original family. If Nia and Yanni run back to their homes now, it will be a shame for their parents. Because only women who have been abandoned by men will go back. Therefore, if Nia and Yanni want to go back, their parents will never let them enter the house. Even if Nia and Yanni die outside, they won't care. Nia was talking to herself, and she thought for a while. Suddenly, she seemed to remember something, looked at Yanni and said, "I remembered that when I was collecting in the forest, I found an uninhabited cave. I think it can be our residence for the time being, and we can make a fire in the cave and collect food in the forest. That'll be fine." A cave in the forest, Yanni blinked and said, "Is it dangerous?" Forest, for the tribe, is a word that people both love and hate. Almost all the food in the tribe comes from the forest, but similarly, many people in the tribe died while collecting food in the forest. Food means life, but entering the forest means the possibility of death. Now I heard Nia say that she wanted to find a cave to live in over there in the forest. This statement made Yanni feel a little uneasy. Nia said, "No way." She looked at Yanni and said, "If we don't go, we won't have a place to stay tonight." The civilization that Nia and Yanni live in is a Stone Age civilization, in which wild beasts roam freely. Sleeping outside at night is simply free food for the wild beasts. Almost certain death. Nia looked at the hesitant Yanni and said, "Let's go." Yanni was silent for a moment and nodded slightly. "That's all." Other side. Hyukshuan, who was watching the scene through the screen, slightly stretched her eyebrows and said, "Those people are so disgusting, they actually robbed the things that their husbands left for them." Betty sat cross-legged on the sofa, folded her little hands on her chest, looked at the picture, and said, "No matter which civilization or world you are in, possessing treasures is a sin, and you will inevitably be targeted." Hyukshuan hummed, "That's right, they are the ones planning to live in a cave." Betty said, "Civilized people always dig holes in mountains to use as shelter. If there is no shelter, they will be picked up by wild beasts." "Oh, that's it." Hyukshuan's expression was full of novelty. Within the screen, Nia took Yanni into the forest. It is now afternoon on the planet where Nia and Yanni are. The sun is bright. After Yanni and Nia entered the forest, they walked cautiously in one direction. "Well, that's right there." Nia raised her finger and pointed in a direction. Yanni looked along the direction of Nia's finger, and she could see that there was indeed a cave over there. Yanni's blue tail shook slightly, and she said, "Why is there a cave here?" Nia smiled and walked inside. She said, "People probably made the cave in the past and moved it away. Now we can live in it." While talking, Nia entered the cave. "This cave is very narrow." "It's so narrow," Yanni said as she walked. "This cave is indeed too narrow. It feels like a tunnel. When you reach the end of the cave, it is slightly more spacious. But compared to the cave where their family lived, it was almost incomparable." "Maybe, the caves where people lived in the past were like this," Nia said softly. Hearing what Nia said, Yanni nodded slightly. "I think it might be." Roar! Suddenly, a beast roar came from outside the cave. This beast roar is full of anger. At the same time as the beast roar was heard, a rustling sound could be heard coming from the entrance of the cave. "Hear this sound." The little faces of Yanni and Nia changed. Yanni subconsciously looked at the entrance of the cave, and saw a huge black shadow running in from the cave. "It's a mountain bear." Mountain bears like to dig holes in mountains as shelter. This cave was made by a mountain bear. This is the mountain bear's home. Looking at the mountain bear, which was 2 meters tall and extremely strong, running towards the side with a ferocious and angry face. Yanni and Nia both looked pale. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 434. Even if the warriors of the tribe saw this creature in the wild, they could only turn around and run away. In the tribe, no one dares to fight such a creature. Fighting a mountain bear is simply asking for death. But now Yanni and Nia are actually staying in the mountain bear's den. The mountain bear was very angry. It was obvious that it thought that Yanni and Nia were planning to rob its nest, which made the mountain bear angry. It's over. No matter who is facing the angry mountain bear, he will die. What's more, both Yanni and Nia are in such a narrow cave. The only escape exit of the cave is behind the mountain bear. Yanni and Nia will definitely die. This is literally food delivered to your door. Seeing this scene, He Yuxuan's expression changed slightly. Betty stood up. At the same time, the mountain bear raised its huge claws to grab Yanni and Nia. Ah! Nia screamed and hurriedly threw herself into Yanni's arms. The two women hugged each other. At this moment when she was extremely close to death, Yanni thought of that man. Yanni has been waiting for him to come back, but at the last moment, she still didn't wait. Will I never see him again? This thought arose, and Yanni was filled with fear, but there was nothing she could do about it. Suddenly, the sound of flesh and blood being separated sounded in Yanni's ears. The severe pain I imagined did not appear. Yanni opened her eyes and looked forward. At first glance, Yanni's eyes lit up. In front of her, a man stood beside her, and in front of the man, the huge mountain bear had been broken into two parts and was lying on the ground. The man turned around and looked at Yanni and Nia. Are you okay? This man is clearly Chen Tao. Yanni and Nia came to their senses. Nia quickly threw herself into Chen Tao's arms. Chen Tao only felt the fragrant breeze blowing over him, and the petite Nia entered Chen Tao's arms. I miss you so much. Nia hid her face in Chen Tao's arms and cried. Chen Tao was slightly startled, then he raised his head, gently stroked her dark blue hair, and said, Don't cry, be good. Nia cried loudly. It was obvious that Nia was extremely aggrieved. The residence you left for us was robbed, the eternal tree was also robbed, and we were almost beaten to death by a mountain bear. I thought I would never see you again in this life. Yeah, woo. She was crying so loudly and talking as she cried. Hearing this, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, and he looked at Yanni. Yanni did not rush over, but she stood there, looking directly at Chen Tao, and tears could be seen on her face. She cried too. Just didn't cry out loud. Crying without making a sound is the saddest thing. Seeing her expression, Chen Tao stretched out his hand and opened his arms. Yanni's eyes glowed with a hint of luster. She walked over and snuggled into Chen Tao's arms. Chen Tao held the two girls in his arms, stroking their backs to comfort them. In this era of Yanni and Nia, their lives are in danger at any time. Of course Chen Tao knew about this, and of course he would not commit such a stupid thing. Although Chen Tao wanted to use time to make Yanni and Nia forget about him, he had no intention of letting them die. So leave sensors on them. Whenever they encounter a crisis, Chen Tao can feel it. Using the transportation ability of the micro wormhole, he can also reach them as soon as possible and save them. Chen Tao looked at the two girls in his arms. Chen Tao said gently, Okay, don't cry. I'm done with my work. I can stay with you and help you solve your problems. Nia raised her face, with a pair of clear blue eyes under her long and curved eyelashes. She looked at Chen Tao and said, What are you going to do? Hearing this, Chen Tao looked at the delicate little face in front of him. Although Nia's skin color is different from Chen Tao's, it does not affect her beauty. She has long and narrow eyelashes, big eyes, a high nose bridge and thin lips. She is more than 1.5 meters tall, but has a well-proportioned figure. Her waist is full and her upper body is holding up the animal skin. Under the ultra-short animal skin skirt is a pair of slender and straight legs. Frankly speaking, even according to the aesthetics of the earthly people, she can be considered a beauty, and her skin color does not affect her beauty. On the contrary, it gave her an exotic feel. The bold and simple outfit gives her a wild beauty. She was like a wild fox, exuding wild charm. Look at her little face filled with tears. Chen Tao held her face in his hands, moved closer to her, and kissed her thin lips. Parted lips. Chen Tao looked at her. She fluttered her eyelashes and slowly opened her eyes. There was a trace of confusion in her big eyes as she looked at Chen Tao. What is Chen Tao doing? She doesn't quite understand. There is no such thing as kissing in this civilization. But it felt pretty good and she liked it. Chen Tao looked at her expression and smiled. Very fragrant. Chen Tao didn't expect that Nia smelled so good. Chen Tao said, "Okay, let's go back to our home. I want to see who is so bold and dares to occupy our home." Nia hummed and said, "I'll take you there." Nia was very happy that her man was back. She led the way, taking Chen Tao and Yani back to the gate of the villa. It is evening now, and the sky in the west is red. The villa in front was also dyed golden by the setting sun. The gate of the villa was open, and at the gate stood a man with a bone knife tied around his waist. The man saw Chen Tao and the other two coming. He frowned and said, "Nia, don't you guys understand? This place will belong to the tribe in the future. You two are no longer members of the tribe. What are you doing back?" Nia frowned, stood up and said, "Nice, this place was left to me and Yani by my man. You just occupy it like this. What's the difference between you and the robbers? Yani and I didn't agree to give this place to you." When Nice heard it, he narrowed his eyes and said, "You're looking for death, right?" He pulled out the bone sword from his waist and said, "You two, get out of here quickly, otherwise, I'll chop you off." "You dare?" Suddenly, Chen Tao's voice rang out. The voices came together. Nice's pupils shrank, and he felt as if his throat was held by a hand, and the strong sense of oppression was restrained. Nice's face was pale, as if an invisible big hand had grabbed his throat and lifted him up in the air. Nice struggled in the air, covering his throat with his hands, as if he was trying to get rid of the pressure on his throat, but in fact, there was nothing next to his throat. Nice's eyes rolled up. This was because Chen Tao used the gene function to reprogram the air pressure next to Nice's throat, which resulted in such an effect. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 435. The struggle of Nice's hands and feet slowly became weaker as time went by. Seeing Nice's pupils turning up, he could no longer hold on any longer. Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. Bang! Nice fell to the ground. Nis struggled to get up, panting heavily, and looked at Chen Tao with trembling pupils. Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly and he said, "Get out." Ness's face turned pale, and he rolled and crawled away. Watching Nice leave, Chen Tao withdrew his gaze, looked at the villa in front of him, and stepped into the villa. Chen Tao glanced around the villa, and his eyes fell on the eternal tree. The eternal tree stood there quietly as before, with fruits hanging on it. "I wonder if people from the tribe are in the house." Nia looked at the door of the residence inside. She looked a little worried. Looking at Nia's expression, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, and he glanced at the room behind him. Time stops passing. The entire villa turned into a blue code. Through the code, Chen Tao could see the situation in the entire villa. After seeing clearly, Chen Tao's eyebrows relaxed slightly. Time resumes its passage. Everything is restored to its original state. Chen Tao said, "It seems that they haven't planned to live in our house directly, or in other words, they haven't discussed what to do with our house. Now, except for the three of us, there is no one else in our house." "Is that so?" Nia's eyes shone slightly, and she said, "Then I'll go back for a while. I want to take a bath. Yani, do you want to go too?" When Yanni heard this, she looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao smiled, go if you want to, girls should like it more. Take a shower regularly to be clean. Clean girls are lovable. Of course Chen Tao hopes that his woman can bathe often. Well, then I'll go, Yanni said softly. Chen Tao nodded slightly. At the same time, Betty and He Yuxuan looked at the scene in front of them. He Yuxuan's eyebrows slightly stretched, she smiled and said, it seems that my husband likes these two women very much, and he actually installed sensing codes on them. Betty frowned and said, you're such a playboy. With so many girls like us, you're still messing around. She puffed out her cheeks, looking a little dissatisfied. Seeing Betty's expression, He Yuxuan smiled and said, there's nothing we can do about it. Who made us fall in love with such a playboy like him? Humph, I don't like him. He forced me to do it, so I had to follow him. Betty would not admit that she liked that man. He Yuxuan looked at Betty, who had a bulging face and made an unhappy sound. For a moment, He Yuxuan couldn't help but plan to tease Betty. She laughed and said, you really don't like him? Of course I don't. Betty puffed her face and said, who would like him? He is carefree, bad, and loves to bully others. He always ignores my ideas and bullies others. Well. He Yuxuan raised her leg and placed it on top of the other leg, crossed her legs, looked at Betty, and said with a smile, well, Chen Tao listens to me very much, I can tell him what you think. Clearly, I ask him not to touch you, is that okay? Betty was startled and looked at He Yuxuan, will he listen to you? He Yuxuan smiled and said, of course, I have known him much earlier than you. And I am different from you. I don't like to joke. What I say is more serious, so when I speak out, he just think about it seriously. As for you, he will always think that you are just acting coquettishly, so you don't think about it seriously. If I tell Chen Tao you're feeling seriously, Chen Tao will definitely think about it carefully, and he will probably never touch you again. He Yuxuan looked at Betty and said with a smile, then, is that okay? Let me tell Chen Tao, your thoughts? Betty said, no. He Yuxuan smiled, no? Why not? Could it be that what you just said was false? Betty blushed and was a little panicked for a moment, but she quickly maintained her composure. She said, I can only express my feelings. Tell me, what is this? He Yuxuan snorted and said, is that so? But he doesn't believe you. It's up to me to say that he will believe it. She looked at Betty playfully and said with a smile, you don't want me to help you, does that mean that you are actually acting like a spoiled brat? Or, in other words, you are arrogant. You say no, but in your heart you are expecting him to bully you. He Yuxuan smiled and said, is that so? Betty's face turned slightly red and she said, no. She glared at He Yuxuan and said, you're talking nonsense, forget it, I won't tell you anymore. She got up and walked to the bedroom. Looking at Betty's slender back, He Yuxuan stretched her eyebrows slightly and smiled. This girl. He Yuxuan knew that Betty was actually much older than her, but in He Yuxuan's view, Betty was still a little girl. Although she is actually very old, Betty still has the thoughts of a little girl, and her body shape is directly proportional to her thoughts, which are all the thoughts of a little loli. Can't hide it at all. This is actually quite cute, and He Yuxuan really likes it. He Yuxuan withdrew her gaze and looked at the scene in front of her. Other side. Chen Tao returned to the villa, sat on the sofa, and looked around. Chen Tao has never come in this villa since he gave it to Yanni and Nia. However, now that I come in, I feel very friendly. Because the furnishings of this villa are the same as those at base number 1. Rust, rustle. There was the sound of footsteps. Chen Tao raised his face and looked towards the source of the sound. At first glance, Chen Tao's eyes lit up slightly. I saw Yanni walking out wearing the white shirt Chen Tao prepared for her. The white shirt fits Yanni's proud figure, making her eyes sparkle. Yanni's skin is as white as cream, with a trace of pores visible, and some skin is faintly blue. It is a healthy light blue halo, which makes Yanni look even more beautiful. The long dark blue hair, paired with a white foxtail and ears, did not ruin Yanni's beauty, but instead added an exotic touch to her. As a fox girl, Yanni has a special wildness all over her body. Yanni looked at Chen Tao. She walked over and said softly, "These clothes feel a little weird." She didn't take it well. Chen Tao smiled and said, "Come." He stretched out his hand, took Yanni's hand, and pulled it gently. Yanni fell into Chen Tao's arms and looked at Chen Tao with her big eyes. Eyes facing each other. Chen Tao smiled, his eyes fell on her beautiful face, and he slowly lowered his face. Kissed Yanni. After a long time, we left. Chen Tao looked at Yanni's face. Yanni's eyelashes trembled slightly, and she slowly opened her eyes. There was moisture in her eyes, and she looked at Chen Tao in confusion. Chen Tao said with a smile, "I think it's very suitable." You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 436. Yanni's pair of white ears on the left and right sides of her head slowly drooped. She looked at Chen Tao with her big, moving eyes, which were filled with confusion. Yanni looked at Chen Tao, and then said softly, "As long as you like it, I will wear whatever you want me to wear for you." The soft voice made Chen Tao's blood boil. Chen Tao showed a smile, slowly approached Yanni, and gently touched her small cheek with his hand, feeling the softness of her skin. Smell the fragrance of her body up close. Chen Tao slowly approached Yanni's face. Yanni's eyelashes trembled slightly, and her blue eyes were filled with confusion. Chen Tao kissed her. It took a long time to slowly relax. Chen Tao looked at Yanni. Her eyes were closed and her eyelashes moved. She slowly opened her eyes and looked at Chen Tao with her moving eyes. Chen Tao smiled, "You're so good." When Yanni saw Chen Tao's smile, Yanni also showed a faint smile. "Tao, look at me, do I look good?" I heard a voice coming from the side. Chen Tao raised his face and looked forward. He saw Nia walking out of the bathroom. Nia is wearing a black off-the-shoulder ultra-short dress prepared by Chen Tao for Nia. The belt gently outlines her slim waist. The hem of the skirt is very short, and below is a pair of slender and straight legs. She has dark blue hair, which is tied into a single ponytail and draped naturally behind her. She has a delicate little face. Although her skin is blue, both her figure and appearance are first-rate. Maybe it's because Nia often goes outside to exercise. She is very healthy and has wild beauty. She was looking at Chen Tao, her eyes full of expectation. Looking at Nia's expression, Chen Tao smiled and said, "Of course, she is beautiful." Hearing Chen Tao's praise, Nia's eyes showed a hint of joy. She smiled, walked to Chen Tao and sat down, gently holding Chen Tao's arm. She looked at Chen Tao and said with a smile, "My dear, next time you leave, take me and Yanni. We don't want to be abandoned by you again." When Nia sat down, Yanni also stood up and slowly sat next to Chen Tao. Hearing Nia's words, Yanni's eyes also lit up slightly. She looked at Chen Tao with a glimmer of expectation in her eyes. She also looked forward to Chen Tao taking her away with him instead of leaving her and Nia here. Chen Tao looked at the expectations in the eyes of the two women. Chen Tao smiled and said, "Yes, I promise you." "Yeah, that's great," Nia cried out happily, happily nestled in Chen Tao's arms, her arms around Chen Tao's neck, and her big, sapphire-like eyes looked at Chen Tao obediently. Meeting Nia's gaze, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. He looked at Nia, smiled, and said, "As long as you like her." Nia hummed, her sapphire eyes full of joy. Sha. There was the sound of footsteps. The sound came from the doorway. Hearing footsteps coming from the door, Chen Tao subconsciously turned his face and looked sideways. At the gate, a man wearing animal skin clothing and holding a bone knife walked in from the door. Behind the man, there was a group of people. A group of men who also wore animal skins, held bone knives, and had blue fox ears and tails. His eyes fell on Chen Tao. Its sensuo Nia stood up quickly, staring straight at the man who broke in at the door, her eyebrows furrowed tightly. Chen Tao's eyebrows relaxed slightly. He stood up slowly and looked at Sensuo at the door. The man named Sensuo had a strong build and was estimated to be about 1.9 meters tall. He was holding a bone knife. The knife made from the bones of wild beasts looked quite sharp. Sensuo is the warrior of our tribe. He once fought a wild wolf alone. Nia looked at Chen Tao and said with some worry, "My dear, be careful." Chen Tao looked at Nia. He smiled, raised his hand and stroked Nia's hair. Then he walked out and walked to Sensuo. He raised his lower face slightly, crossed his hands around his chest, and looked at Sensuo. Said, "I heard that you want to occupy my home." Sensuo frowned, stared at Chen Tao, and said, "I'm not interested in where you live." Chen Tao's eyebrows slightly stretched. "If you are not interested, then why did you bring so many people and break in?" As he said that, he looked at the group of people behind Sensuo. Sensuo said, "I'm not interested in where you live, but the place where the tree grows is right next to our tribe. It was given to our tribe by God, but you want to monopolize it. We don't agree with this." Chen Tao inexplicably became a cheap god. "Nonsense." Nia stepped out. She looked at Sensuo and said, "This tree was created by my man and was left by him to me and Yani. When did it become a gift from God? Can it be transformed?" Sensuo looked at Nia and said, "Nia, are you dreaming? Can it be transformed? Can trees be transformed?" Nia was startled. She frowned and said, "I saw this with my own eyes. He was the one who conjured that tree." She looked at Chen Tao. Sensuo's eyebrows slightly stretched and he said, "Nia, you have made some progress. In order to keep your tree and prevent it from becoming a tribal thing, you can tell lies so fluently." Nia frowned. I said it was true. I didn't lie." "Ha." Sensuo sneered, looked away, and didn't bother to look at Nia. He stared at Chen Tao and said lightly, "Hand over the tree, and I won't kill you three." Chen Tao looked at Sensuo and said, "Why do you think that tree was given to your tribe by God?" Sensuo frowned and said, "The tree grows near our tribe's territory. Isn't it obvious that it was given to us by God? Hurry up and hand over the tree. You can live here and hand the tree back to us." "That's fine, we have no interest in your lives." Chen Tao smiled and said, "I think that tree was given to Yani and Nia by God." "Humph, then there's no need to talk." Sensuo held the bone knife tightly in his hand and stared at Chen Tao, as if he was about to take action at any time. Looking at Sensuo's expression, Chen Tao's eyebrows relaxed slightly. He smiled and said, "Why don't we talk? I have a way to prove that what I said is true." "Prove?" Sensuo stared at Chen Tao. He squinted and looked at Chen Tao and said, "You want to prove that that tree was given to Yani and Nia by God?" "Well, yes." Chen Tao looked at Sensuo. Sensuo frowned, then relaxed his eyebrows slightly and said, "This is what you said. If you can't prove it, then the tree must be handed over to us." Chen Tao smiled, "Okay, if I can't prove it, I'll give you that tree. My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 437. Listening to what Chen Tao said, Nia and Yani couldn't help but look at Chen Tao. Yani looked at Chen Tao and said, "Tao." Chen Tao looked at Yani, raised his hand, stroked Yani's hair, and said with a smile, let's go out and prove it." As he said that, Chen Tao looked at the group of people blocking the door, his eyes fell on Sensuo, and said, "Can you move aside? If you don't move aside, how can I prove it?" Sensuo frowned slightly, and he said, "Move aside." Sensuo made way, and the blue-skinned people behind him also made way. Chen Tao put his hands behind his back, stepped out, and walked to the eternal tree. He looked at the eternal tree in front of him. "How are you going to prove it?" Sensuo walked over and looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao looked at Sensuo and said, "It's simple. Trees are alive. We just need to ask it if it is given by God to Yanni and Nia." "Ask," Sensuo frowned, "your brain is not working well, right? Trees are alive, but they are plants, how can they answer?" Chen Tao looked at Sensuo and said with a smile, "Why not?" Sensuo smiled, stared at Chen Tao and said, "What if it doesn't make a sound and doesn't answer you?" Chen Tao looked at Sensuo and said with a smile, "If it doesn't respond as you said, then it means I can't prove that this tree is yours." "Okay." As soon as Chen Tao finished speaking, Sensuo agreed directly. Sensuo put the bone knife in his hand into the animal skin scabbard at his waist, then crossed his arms around his chest, stared at Chen Tao playfully, and said, "Then prove it quickly, I can't wait." Chen Tao looked at Sensuo's expression, he smiled, and his eyes fell on the eternal tree in front of him. Tao's small hand beside him held the corner of Chen Tao's clothes. Chen Tao was slightly startled, and he turned his head to look at Yanni beside him. Yanni looked at Chen Tao, her eyes full of worry. How could a tree speak this kind of proof? He has already said that he will prove it this way, Sensuo said coldly. He regrets now, which means he can't prove it, so this tree must be handed over honestly, and you three have to get out of here. Yanni pursed her lips and looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao raised his hand and stroked Yanni's hair. He gave Yanni a gentle smile. That was a smile that made Yanni feel at ease. Looking at Chen Tao's smile, although Yanni was full of doubts in her heart, she could only let go of Chen Tao's clothes. Chen Tao looked at the tree in front of him. Is this guy stupid? He actually wants to talk to a tree. I guess he is really stupid. That's a tree. How can the tree respond to him? Listening to the discussion next to him, Chen Tao looked at the eternal tree in front of him, and he said, "Tree, are you given to Nia and Yanni by God?" The eternal tree seemed to hear Chen Tao's voice. A pair of arms made of pure wood grew strangely from its trunk. Seeing these arms, "What is that?" someone asked in panic. "Is it a hand?" The tree grew a hand. Is it because of what the man said? How is this possible? How can a tree grow a hand? Sensuo's face beside Chen Tao also changed. At this time, the tree raised its hand and picked a piece of fruit from the leaves with the hand made of wood. Then it reached out. When Sensuo saw it, he stepped back in panic. After the hand of the tree reached out, it stopped in front of Yanni and Nia. The hand made of the trunk slowly opened, revealing the fruit in the palm. Looking at the fruit in the palm, Yanni and Nia were slightly startled and looked at Chen Tao together. Chen Tao smiled and said, "Take it." Yanni and Nia raised their hands and picked up a fruit. Everyone looked at the scene with wide eyes, including Sensuo. Sensuo's mouth opened wide, his pupils trembled, and his expression showed a trace of disbelief. Chen Tao looked at Sensuo's expression and said with a smile, "Is this proof enough? Let the tree grow arms, this is too simple for Chen Tao. He can use genetic functions to program living humans. It is too simple to program a tree man who will act according to his own wishes." Sensuo's pupils trembled, looking at the tree trunk with arms, he swallowed and said, "Enough, enough." Hearing this, Chen Tao couldn't help but smile. Chen Tao said, "Then do you still want to steal our trees?" No, Sensuo looked panicked, and he hurriedly said, "Let's go." Sensuo led people out, and they all ran out in one go. Looking at the backs of those people leaving, Chen Tao's eyebrows slightly relaxed, and he crossed his arms. "Dear, what's the matter with that tree?" a girl's voice came from the side. Hearing this voice, Chen Tao looked back at Nia beside him. Nia was looking at Chen Tao with her moving eyes, and her expression showed a hint of doubt. Looking at Nia's expression, Chen Tao's eyebrows slightly relaxed, and said with a smile, "I can turn a tree into something, so it's certainly not difficult to make the tree move." When Nia heard this, her eyes lit up slightly, and she also smiled. "That's right, you can turn a tree into something, and it's not surprising that you can make a tree move." Chen Tao smiled, raised his hand, and stroked Nia's hair. Nia closed her eyes comfortably, feeling Chen Tao's touch. Looking at Nia's expression, Chen Tao smiled and said, "Are you hungry?" When Nia heard this, she looked at Chen Tao and said, "Well, a little." Then she looked at the fruit in her hand. Chen Tao smiled and said, "Don't eat this fruit. I'll prepare something more delicious for you." Nia's eyes lit up slightly and said, "Really?" Yani heard Chen Tao talking. She looked at Chen Tao, her big eyes full of expectation. Looking at Yani's expression, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, and he smiled and said, "Let's go into the house." "Yeah." Nia followed Chen Tao, jumping and following, her hand around Chen Tao's arm. And Yani followed Chen Tao obediently, very quiet. The three entered the house. Sit under Chen Tao's arrangement, Nia and Yani sat on the sofa together. Chen Tao also sat down and sat on the sofa. Chen Tao opened the micro wormhole, took out 3 plates of steak from it, and moved them to the table. The aroma suddenly filled her nose. Smelling the aroma, Nia's eyes lit up. "It smells so good, it smells so good." Nia looked at Chen Tao, her eyes were full of joy, and she smiled and said, "This is the first time I smell this kind of fragrance." Nia looked at Chen Tao and said, "Can I start eating?" Yeah, Chen Tao smiled and said, "Of course." Nia reached out and picked up the steak. "Ah," Nia quickly let go. She frowned, put her hand in front of her mouth, exhaled, and said, "It's so hot. My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 438. Seeing Nia's reaction, Chen Tao smiled and said, "Use this tableware." He handed the knife and fork to Nia. Nia took it, looked at the knife and fork in her hand, she blinked, then picked up the fork with her right hand, inserted it directly into the steak, used the fork to prop up the steak. She moved her small mouth closer and took a light bite. Nia exhaled and said, "It's so hot, so fragrant, so tender, so delicious. Well, it's still so hot." Nia furrowed her eyebrows cutely, but there was a delicious surprise in her eyes. Looking at Nia's expression, Chen Tao smiled. "This steak is not small. I didn't use a knife to cut it, I just used a fork. The way this girl eats it is really rough. However, it is no wonder that this is the case. After all, in the era where Nia and Yani lived, even iron products could not be seen." On the other hand, Yani sat quietly. Although food and tableware were placed in front of her, she still did not move. She just looked here quietly, as if she was studying. Seeing Yani's expression, Chen Tao smiled, looked away, looked at Nia, and said, "That's it." He picked up the knife and fork, pressed the fork against the steak, cut it off with the knife, then put the fork on the cut beef and put it into his mouth. Seeing Chen Tao's slow manner, Yani's eyes brightened slightly, and she also imitated Chen Tao and picked up the knife and fork. When Nia saw this, she smiled, so that's it, she also started to study. Seeing the two women studying seriously, Chen Tao smiled. So cute, these two girls. The steak was half eaten. Chen Tao said, "You two, do you want to drink?" Drinking, lively Nia was the first to react. She looked at Chen Tao and said, "What is that?" Upon hearing this, Chen Tao was slightly startled and looked at Yanni. Yanni also looked here, with doubts in her eyes. Wine, yes, that's right. The civilization in this world is too backward. There are no iron products, let alone wine. Their civilization doesn't even have a word for wine. Chen Tao smiled and said, that's it? Take out a bottle of red wine and 3 wine glasses from the micro wormhole and place them on the table. He opened the red wine bottle with familiarity, and then slowly filled 3 wine glasses with red liquid. The liquid is filled. He handed the wine glasses to the 2 women respectively. Nia looked at the wine glass and then at Chen Tao. She imitated the way Chen Tao held a cup, picked up the wine glass, and looked at Chen Tao with big eyes. Chen Tao looked at Nia and smiled. He picked up the wine glass and took a sip. Nia blinked. She picked up the wine glass and sniffed it with her nose. She quirked her eyebrows cutely and said, what a strange smell. She looked at the wine glass in her hand uneasily, then followed Chen Tao's example and took a sip. Drink it in one gulp. Nia frowned her slender eyebrows and said, ah. It tastes so strange and not good to drink. She put the wine glass on the table, looking like she didn't like it. Looking at Nia's expression, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, he smiled, and then looked at Yanni. Seeing Nia's expression, Yanni frowned cutely, looking at the wine glass in her hand, she pursed her thin lips, seeming a little uneasy, but she still chose to drink. She took a small sip and her eyebrows furrowed deeper. Suddenly, Yanni's eyebrows stretched slightly and she pursed her lips. Looking at Yanni's expression, Chen Tao smiled and said, how is it? Yanni was slightly startled. She looked at Chen Tao and said, it's a bit strange, but, fortunately, it's not that bad. Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. Everyone reacts differently to drinking alcohol, some like it and some don't. The feeling of Yanni's sip is different from Nia's, which means that if Yanni drinks more, she will drink more in the future. But Nia is different. Unexpectedly, Nia is lively and active, but not so sensitive to wine, while Yanni is very quiet, but can drink wine well. Interesting. Chen Tao smiled and said, if you like it, you can try more. If you don't like it, just eat meat. Yeah, Nia said with a smile, I eat meat. She cut off more than half of the meat with a knife, put it into her mouth, and then chewed it with a look of delight on her face. This meat is so delicious, it tastes so fragrant, and the meat is so tender and delicious. Looking at Nia's expression, Chen Tao smiled and looked at Yanni. Yanni cut a small piece of beef, ate a small bite, and then took a sip of wine. Her eyes were slightly bright and she looked very satisfied. Seeing this, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. Chen Tao smiled. Finished the meal and drank the wine. Nia was okay, but Yanni's face turned slightly blue and her eyes were a little blurry. She looked a little drunk. Chen Tao held Yanni in his arms. Huh, Yanni said softly. She looked at Chen Tao with her big moving eyes, full of doubts. Meet Chen Tao's gaze. Chen Tao smiled and said, you've been drinking, I'll take you to rest. Drunk, Yanni's voice seemed to come from the sky, very light and drunk. There was no alcohol in their world, and there was certainly no such thing as being drunk. Chen Tao smiled and said, it's nothing. I don't care. While talking, the two entered the bedroom. Chen Tao laid Yanni down on the big bed. His eyes fell on Yanni. Yanni's skin was as white as gelatin, and her skin was delicate. There was a hint of blue in her fair skin, but she was very beautiful. Looking at Yanni's figure, Chen Tao looked up and landed on Yanni's little face. Yanni looked at Chen Tao with blurred eyes. Chen Tao's big hand fell on her little cheek, gently stroked it, and he leaned down. Yanni closed her eyes. 3 hours passed in the blink of an eye. Chen Tao lay on the bed, looking at the ceiling, he adjusted his mood, and looked at the girl beside him. On the right was Yanni, Yanni closed her eyes and slept soundly. Chen Tao retracted his gaze and looked to the left. On the left was Nia, she was also asleep. Looking at the two women, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, retracted his gaze, and looked at the ceiling. There was still no way, they all became his women, which felt very novel. After all, these were people from another civilization. Chen Tao originally planned to let them forget about him, but Chen Tao did not expect that it would be like this in the end. Soft-heartedness is a disease that needs to be cured. If I hadn't been soft-hearted and saved Yanni and given her a flower, things wouldn't have turned out like this. Chen Tao's current mood is a mixture of pain and happiness. Pain is that he has violated his promise again, and happiness is that he has gained another beauty. "Dear," a voice came from the side. Chen Tao came back to his senses, and he looked at the beauty beside him. Nia was looking at Chen Tao weakly with her moving eyes. She pursed her thin lips gently, slowly leaned into Chen Tao's arms, and whispered, "Don't leave us again, we can't live without you." Chen Tao's heart trembled slightly, and he looked at Nia. Chen Tao breathed a sigh of relief. It seems that he has to take them back. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 439. Chen Tao looked at Nia beside him, raised his big hand and stroked Nia's hair. At such a close distance, Chen Tao could smell Nia's unique body fragrance, which was like the fragrance of Osman thus. Chen Tao looked at Nia beside him, looking at her delicate face, he became more gentle, raised his hand and gently stroked Nia's cheek. Nia had a faint smile on her face, she closed her eyes, but her face was full of joy. She said softly, "I have waited for you for a long, long time. Yanni and I are looking forward to your return every day." Chen Tao blinked his eyes and looked at Nia. Nia said, "But, we waited and waited, but you didn't show up, and you didn't come back. But when we were waiting for you, those people in our tribe thought you abandoned us, so they brought so many people to bully me and Yanni, and wanted to rob the tree and the house you left for us. Yanni and I had no choice. We wanted to find a place to live in the forest, but who knew that place was actually the residence of mountain bears? We almost died. I thought I would never see you in this life," Nia whispered softly, describing her feelings. Chen Tao looked at Nia's expression. She looked different from humans on Earth. She had animal ears and tails, and her skin was blue. Chen Tao looked at Nia, and always had a feeling that it was a feeling different from reality, like an illusion. But listening to Nia's beautiful voice, feeling her body temperature, and smelling her unique fragrance, Chen Tao found that this was very real. Although she looked different from the humans that Chen Tao knew, she was real. She could hear her voice, and she had body temperature and body fragrance. Chen Tao gently hugged her, then moved closer and kissed Nia's forehead. Nia's big eyes trembled slightly, the corners of her mouth raised, and her face was full of joy. Chen Tao smiled, and he gently stroked Nia's shoulder. Nia was different from Yanni. Yanni's skin was white jade, while Nia's skin was the traditional blue skin of the civilization. Although it was blue, it was still beautiful, delicate, and smooth. She was delicate and charming, and looked very lovely. She lay on her side, and this posture just outlined her figure. Her waist was slender and her legs were long and straight. Her figure was incomparably proud. Chen Tao said, "Sleep with me, I'll take you home tomorrow." "Home?" She looked at Chen Tao with her moving eyes. Chen Tao smiled and said, "Yes, go home, go back to our home." Her eyes were shining, and she said, "Yeah." Chen Tao turned slightly to the side, hugged her petite girl, and whispered to her ear, "Then there is still a long time from today to tomorrow night. During this time, let me feel you again, okay?" Her eyes were misty, and she slowly closed her eyes. Yeah. Hearing her obedient response, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly and smiled. Good. Early in the morning of the next day, Chen Tao's consciousness recovered, and as soon as he recovered, he could smell a fragrance and feel the warmth in his arms. He slowly opened his eyes and saw a delicate little face. This little face is really Nia's face. Nia closed her eyes, she was sleeping soundly. Looking at Nia's expression, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. Chen Tao gently stroked Nia's shoulders and slowly stroked her blue hair. Nia's eyelashes trembled slightly, she slowly opened her eyes, revealing her sapphire eyes. She was confused for a moment, and then looked at Chen Tao. Looking at Nia's expression, Chen Tao smiled and gently stroked her face. Nia's eyes were shining, and she looked at Chen Tao. Their eyes met. Nia's eyebrows stretched slightly. There was a smile on her face, she slowly raised her little face, her eyes were shining with a trace of moisture, she looked at Chen Tao, raised her thin lips, and closed her eyes. Nia looked like she was ready to be kissed by you. Looking at Nia's expression, Chen Tao slowly approached Nia and kissed her. Lips parted. Nia's eyelashes moved, revealing her charming eyes, she looked at Chen Tao, and a smile appeared on her face. Chen Tao smiled and said, "So good." Nia hummed softly, and slowly hid her body in Chen Tao's arms. Chen Tao gently stroked her hair, his movements were gentle. Creaking. Suddenly, there was a sound, the sound of the door opening. Hearing the sound of the door opening, Chen Tao looked towards the source of the sound. Chen Tao could see the bathroom door slowly opening, and a beautiful figure walked out of the bathroom. The owner of the beautiful figure was Yanni. Yanni was wearing a short-sleeved white t-shirt, which naturally stuck to her charming figure. Her hair was tied up, revealing her fair neck. The hem of the t-shirt was very short, and her legs were slender and straight, and her skin was as white as cream. She was looking at Chen Tao with her charming eyes. Their eyes met. Chen Tao looked at Yanni, he smiled, and got off the bed. He walked in front of her. Yanni was slightly startled, she looked at Chen Tao, and her fair cheeks were light blue. Chen Tao looked at Yanni, he smiled, raised his hand, and held her horizontally in his arms. Yanni looked at Chen Tao with her sapphire eyes. Chen Tao sat on the sofa, put Yanni in his arms, gently hugged her waist, and a micro wormhole appeared. On the table in front of Chen Tao, there were many foods. These were all from the restaurant of Gene number 1. What are these? Yanni looked at Chen Tao curiously. Hearing this, Chen Tao smiled and said, "Food." He hugged her waist with one hand, picked up the bowl and chopsticks with the other hand, and handed them to Yanni. Yanni blinked, raised her little hand, took it, and then looked at Chen Tao, her face full of confusion. She said, "What is this?" Looking at Yanni's expression, Chen Tao smiled, "Rice, this is what I eat over there, come and try it." Yanni looked at Chen Tao, she held the rice in one hand and the chopsticks in the other. She held the chopsticks in a gripping way, a pair of chopsticks were tightly held in her little hand. This is not the way to hold chopsticks. Yanni took the chopsticks, looked at the rice, and then looked at the chopsticks in her hand. She looked at Chen Tao with her big eyes, full of doubts. She didn't seem to know how to eat the rice. She couldn't hold the chopsticks like this. Looking at Yanni's actions, Chen Tao smiled, "Come on." Chen Tao took the chopsticks from Yanni's hand, held the chopsticks, hugged Yanni, and then picked up some rice with the chopsticks and put it in front of Yanni's mouth. Yanni opened her mouth and took a bite. She chewed gently. Looking at Yanni's expression, Chen Tao smiled and said, "How is it?" Yanni said, "It feels very light, no taste." "I want it too," a voice came. Chen Tao looked at Nia beside him. Nia was wearing a thin shirt and sitting next to him. She looked at Chen Tao with big eyes and smiled. "My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 440. Seeing this, Chen Tao smiled. He also fed Nia the same way he fed Yanni. Nia took a bite and looked at Chen Tao. Well, it's really bland and has no taste. Chen Tao said, rice, of course, must be served with side dishes to be delicious. He picked up the food with his chopsticks and took a bite, enjoying the taste of carbohydrates. Nia looked at the rice and chopsticks that appeared out of thin air on the table. She imitated Chen Tao, picked them up, and then imitated Chen Tao and took a bite. Nia's eyes lit up slightly. She looked at Chen Tao and said with a smile, "It's delicious." Chen Tao smiled and said, "Eat, this is our breakfast today. After eating, I will take you home." Nia was happy. Finished a breakfast. Chen Tao opened a miniature wormhole and then looked at the two women beside him. Yanni and Nia looked at the miniature wormhole together, and then at Chen Tao. "Honey, what is that?" Nia asked. Chen Tao said with a smile, "This is the door to go home. Once we walk out of this door, we can go back. Let's go." Chen Tao stepped into the micro wormhole. Nia and Yanni looked at each other and followed. Walked through a miniature wormhole. Yanni felt her eyes light up slightly, and she looked around. Found this to be a bedroom. The furnishings and decoration of this bedroom are the same as the villa where I lived before. But Yanni discovered something different. Through the window, she could see the blue sky outside. Yanni could often see the woods from that window, but now all she could see was the blue sky. "Isn't this our home?" Nia suddenly said. Chen Tao looked at Nia and said with a smile, "Yes, our home." Nia said, "No, I mean, isn't this bedroom the same house in the forest?" Nia looked at Chen Tao doubtfully and said, "Dear, didn't you say you wanted to take us back to your home? Why are we back here?" Hearing this, Chen Tao smiled. No, before Chen Tao could speak, Yanni spoke up first. When Nia heard this, she looked at Yanni. Yanni looked at Nia and said, "Look at the window over there." Nia looked forward and saw the floor-to-ceiling windows over there. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Nia could see the scenery outside. At this sight, Nia's eyes trembled slightly. Looking towards the floor-to-ceiling windows, there was a blue sky and white clouds over there, but it was nothing like the blue sky and white clouds Nia had seen before. The blue sky is in front, and the white clouds are actually next to the window. The position of the window is actually juxtaposed with the white clouds. Horrified, Nia hurried over and looked down carefully. She suddenly discovered that the position of her window was actually in mid-air. Looking down through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she found that she was actually suspended in the air. Below were patches of white clouds. Through the white clouds, she could see mountains and cities. Nia's eyes trembled slightly, and she subconsciously looked at Chen Tao. "Dear, are we in mid-air?" Hearing this, Chen Tao nodded slightly and said with a smile, "Ours is a big spaceship, and we are in the big spaceship." "Ship?" Nia looked at Chen Tao, her eyes filled with confusion. "What is that?" Chen Tao was startled. I almost forgot that Nia's era was the Stone Age. For Yanni and Nia, she had never seen such a thing as a boat. Chen Tao crossed his arms over his chest. He thought for a moment and said, "Let's put it this way, we are now on a big artificial bird, and then we opened up this residence on the big bird." Nia's eyes lit up slightly. "Then this bird is so big and powerful." Yanni's eyes were also shining. "It's just that I don't quite understand." Nia looked at Chen Tao and said, "If we fly on the bird, how will we collect food? Won't we be hungry if we live here?" Yanni looked at Nia, then looked at Chen Tao. "Dear, have you planted an eternal tree on this big bird?" "Well, by the way, I almost forgot about the eternal tree." Nia smiled and looked at Chen Tao. "It feels weird to plant a tree on a big bird." Upon hearing this, Chen Tao smiled and said, "No, but I won't answer your question for now. If you stay here for a long time, you will know." Nia blinked, hummed slightly, and then looked around. Dong dong. At this time, Chen Tao heard a knock on the door. Hearing the knock on the door, Nia and Yanni looked at each other, then looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao crossed his arms across his chest. He looked at the two women and said with a smile, "I guess your sisters are here." Sisters, Yanni had doubts in her eyes. But Nia had a smile on her face and said, "Is it a girl? Just like us, she is your woman, right?" Chen Tao nodded slightly, walked to the door and opened it. As soon as the door opened, a beautiful figure stood at the door. "Have you lived in this house since?" a voice came, and the speaker was clearly He Yuxuan. He Yuxuan looked into the room with a smile. Chen Tao was slightly startled, and his eyebrows stretched slightly. He Yuxuan entered the house, looked at Yanni and Nia, she smiled and said, "Yanni and Nia." Yanni and Nia looked at each other and looked at He Yuxuan. "Do you know us?" Nia asked. He Yuxuan said with a smile, "I know everyone who has anything to do with Chen Tao. Of course I know you too. Let me introduce myself first. My name is He Yuxuan. Like you, I am his woman." Nia hummed, pursed her lips, and looked at He Yuxuan. Her expression revealed a trace of doubt. "Sister Yuxuan, you have white skin like Chen Tao." Nia looked at He Yuxuan and Chen Tao and said, "Are all the people here like this?" He Yuxuan smiled, "Yes, all the people here are like this." "How amazing!" Nia smiled and said, "I thought only Chen Tao was like this." He Yuxuan smiled. Nia looked at Yanni and said with a smile, "Yanni, see, I have said it, you must not be surprised." Hearing this, Chen Tao was slightly startled, and he looked at Yanni. Yanni's eyes have been staring at He Yuxuan since He Yuxuan appeared. Yanni is a weirdo in their civilization because her skin is different from that of the people in their civilization. Because of this, Yanni is regarded as an alien, excluded and humiliated. Because of this skin problem, Yanni has suffered a lot of white eyes, ridicule, and humiliation. But now, Yanni saw a girl with white skin like herself, and this girl still had a confident smile on her face. Before, because those people regarded Yanni as an alien, Yanni felt very inferior and thought she was also an alien. Now looking at the girl in front of her, Yanni found that she was wrong. It turned out that there were people like her.